So, you want to become the best there is at basing, but you suck. Don't fret, because today we'll take you to third base, from a basing virgin all the way to a basing god. Basing your miniatures and Warhammer figures is one of my favorite parts of the hobby. Because the basing on a miniature matters just as much as the painting can do for the finished end product. It can be daunting to get started, but trust me when I say a good looking base can take your shitty looking miniatures and make them look amazing. And the best thing is, unlike with painting, basing does not require years and years of practice. You can make something look amazing the first time you try. Of course, over the years you're going to get better, you're gonna make better compositions, and you're gonna learn new things and get new tools to add to your arsenal. But even without any previous knowledge, we're gonna make you great. So hopefully today you're gonna learn how to make awesome desert bases, landscapes, dark dank dungeons, forest bases, ocean views, icy landscapes, heck, maybe even lava bases. We'll give you the ins and outs of what you need to create these bases, some quick tips and tricks on how to utilize these tools, what things you need to buy, and what things you can find for free to make your basing good without spending any money. I've split this video into a couple of different chapters to make your life easier, so let's start at the very beginning with basing your first miniature. Classical way of basing your Warhammer minis is quite simple. We have two different ways of doing it. Let's start with the one that I started with. You just simply add a coat of PVA glue to your miniature. You sprinkle a little bit of sand on top of it, and once it's done, you spray it, paint it with one color, and dry brush it. If you picked up a set of grass tufts, you can just add one or two grass tufts, and bada bing, bada boom, you have your first base. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with this base. The second most common one, and maybe even slightly easier, is using texture pastes. That could be from Games Workshop or Vallejo, it doesn't matter, you just add a coat of that, let it dry for a bit, and then you dry brush with a slightly brighter color. The main issue that I have with this type of basing is that these bases look just like everyone else's, and they don't really tell any story. There's many ways that we can improve this, and it doesn't have to cost you a ton of money, and it doesn't have to require a lot of time. So let's start thinking outside the box, and we can do that as well with these miniatures. Just one thing that we can do is to add interesting colors. Maybe instead of having a gray or a brown base, we can make it green or blue. Maybe we can add a light glow from one of the sides that then adds a bit of interest to your basing. But this is pretty much like every time Lucas puts on makeup, it's like polishing a turd.
What the hell, Emil?
So let's get into the more advanced advice. Let's bring out some fun tools to use, because we're gonna make these bases look way more fun and interesting. Chapter 2. Good things to buy. So to get to the next level with your basing, you need more materials. Which ones? Well, that's up for debate. That depends on what miniature bases you want to do. So when you're gonna buy your first miniature tools, make sure that you have an idea of the style of the miniature bases you want to do. Is it a lava base? Is it a jungle base? Is it a sci-fi base? What you purchase is gonna be pretty much dependent on which theme you go with. And the ones that I'm gonna list now are all going to cost you a little bit of money. But the good thing is, when we're done with these ones that cost money, I have a list filled with stuff that you can get for free for your basing. And let's start with the basic, glue. Because no matter which basing you're gonna do, you're gonna need glue. The two most common ones that we use for basing is PVA glue and super glue, and we use these for more than 99% of our bases. We use the super glue or the cyanoacrylate, whichever you like to call it, whenever we do something that needs to dry quickly. If we're gluing a branch together with a miniature, we use the super glue. If we're using sand and we need to do 100 of them and we need them to dry in a second, super glue and an activator is for you. PVA glue is more situational. We mostly use the PVA glue when we do a lot of bases and they can dry overnight. That's when we add sand on top of PVA glue or maybe coconut fiber. We also use the PVA glue as sort of a protection layer for when we use XPS foam to create a base. Because otherwise there's a risk that it melts from the cyanoacrylate or from the primers that you use. So covering XPS foam or styrofoam with a layer of PVA glue is fantastic for basing. And speaking of sand and coconut fiber, let's move on to the second recommendation of things to buy, and that is ground texture. You need something that adds ground texture, and the most simple one is sand. But it can also be one of those pre-mixed ground textures that we mentioned earlier. We have versions from AK Interactive, Vallejo, and Games Workshop. You can get these in a ton of different styles. Maybe it's arena sand or it's mud texture. There's a ton of them and it's fun to try out. One of my personal favorite ground textures is coconut fiber. I get this from IKEA and it just looks amazing as a forest floor. But you can also use a ton of things that you have at home. You can pick up dirt from outside. You can ground up tea leaves and it's gonna look a little bit more like a forest ground as well. But do remember, whenever you use stuff you have at home or that you find outside, make sure that it is sterile, that you've killed all the bacteria that's inside there. Cook it in the oven on a low temperature for a few minutes, and hopefully all the animals and fungi inside there is dead. And when it comes to ground texture, you can never have too many different versions, because having a variety of textures, maybe having sand as if there's a path on your base, and then having that coconut fiber on the side as if it's forest ground on the side of that pathway, creates a strong variation and can really make your bases look cool. So try to collect a bunch of different ones over the years when you do minis. Hopefully you'll be able to make a cool looking ground texture. Which brings us to the third recommendation, ground elevation. There's a ton of things that you can use to create elevation of your bases. The most common one is cork coasters from IKEA. But you can also use XPS foam as we mentioned earlier, or styrofoam, or maybe even branches. Anything you can use to build volume is good. The important thing to note is you don't want this ground elevation to look like the thing that it is. If you have XPS foam, you don't want it to look like XPS foam, right? You want it to look like maybe a rock, or maybe you cover it with sand to make it look like a sandy hill. Because I don't know how many bases I've seen where you just slap a piece of cork on top of the base and you dry brush it with gray and you say that it's a rock, but it just looks like cork that's been dry brushed. So if you're using cork, maybe start removing the edges of it. Make it high enough and then round and remove all the flat surfaces so that it really looks like a rock. Or maybe sculpt on top of it. If you have XPS foam, make sure to cut it with a sharp knife that it gets, sharp edges and make it look like a rock or a mountainside. We've done this a couple of times on different dioramas, like my display board for my iron jaws as an example. And lastly, make sure that it feels like this ground elevation is part of the environment and not just lying on top of it. So that means if you have your ground texture, coconut fiber or sand, make sure it goes up all the way to the edge of the rock. Maybe cover that edge that makes it feel like the cork is just sitting on top of the base. Make it feel like it's a big rock that's sunken into that sand or coconut fiber. If not, your base is gonna look like poo. Fourthly, you need things that looks like rocks. And now I don't mean just cork coasters. You need other things. Here's the thing, you can use regular rocks, put them on your base and they might look like a rock. The problem is that you cannot really in an easy way shape the rocks so that they look the way that you want them to look. Unless you have a diamond bladed saw, then you're not gonna be able to shape that rock and make it sit flat on the base. But maybe you're able to find one that looks amazing. The second problem with regular rocks is that they are heavy. So if you drop your base, the miniature is going to break. Like you cannot drop a base with a rock on it without breaking the mini. And it's almost impossible to find a large enough amount of good looking rocks to make your miniatures look really good on those rock bases. There is one exception, and that is slate. Because those are quite easy to break. If you have a bigger rock, you can break them into small pieces. They're quite thin and easy to make look somewhat flat. And if you decide to go with this route, make sure that you paint the rocks, because if you just put the rocks there, they're just gonna look like real life rocks. You want them to feel like they're part of the miniatures world, so add paint on top of them. Instead, what I would recommend you to use is bark. And I have two types of bark that I normally recommend. One of them is cork bark that I just find at my local pet shop or aquarium store. this one is super easy to break apart and to make look like rock pieces. The second you add paint to it, it looks like a better looking rock for the scale. And the second one that I recommend is pine bark. It is just so easy to use. You add a small piece of it. It looks like slate, but without the weight of the slate. Now you learned everything you need to know about rocks. Let's move on to grass tufts. Grass tufts is life. I have a massive collection of grass tufts. Okay, it might be an addiction, but I love them. Honestly, having a bunch of varied grass tufts and just putting them on the simplest base can still make that simple base look fantastic. It is like the shortcut to making a shitty base look like an average base. And you don't have to spend a ton of money, at least compared to if you're spending money to build an entire army. For 20 bucks you can have 4 different styles of grass tufts, and that should be way enough to make an entire army look pretty amazing. I'm a big proponent of having at least 3 different sizes of grass tufts for your armies, and if you can and you can afford it, buy even more. You buy one super small one that's more like a moss-sized, super tiny grass tuft. You buy one that's medium-sized, maybe it's a regular grass tuft or it's a grass tuft with flowers, and you buy a bigger one like the spiky tufts from Gamer's Grass. Having 3 versions of it and just adding a few to every base is gonna lift your entire army, trust me. And then if you are like me, just keep buying 1 more set of grass tufts every month until you die. And that's when you're going to have to start buying not just 1 or 2 or 3 different cabinets to store grass tufts. You're gonna need like 8 of them, but it's worth it. In our office we have flowers, we have big bushes, we have small bushes, we have green stuff world bushes, we have desert basin grass tufts, we have midland grass tufts, we have icy grass tufts, we have alien grass tufts. But those are ugly, don't buy those. And don't be afraid to paint your grass tufts. If you don't have the exact colors that matches the idea that you want to have for your base, paint it. You can use washes to paint them, you can use regular acrylics and dry brush on top of them. And some cheaper grass tufts are very plasticky, so they have this like plastic sheen to them. If you spray them with ultramatte varnish, boom! They're gonna fit even better with your bases. So don't be afraid to experiment, buy as much as you can afford, because it's worth it. And now let's talk about a different type of grass tufts. The laser cut grass tufts. One of our all-time favorite grass tuft brands, Gamer Grass, have recently started making laser flowers and plants. And these are like a cheat code to make jungle bases look good. Like really, really good. So if you're building like a Katashan army or Lizardman army, complementing your grass tufts with one of these, water effects. We are suckers for water effects. And we might have tried a little bit too many different kinds of water effects on different types of miniatures and scenes. And we've come to the conclusion that they're all great, just for different things. Let's start with UV resin, which is such a simple tool to use if you want to make drool effects, water splashes, small puddles, waves, droplets, just a ton of different things as long as you're using it in a small scale. And if you add a little bit of fluorescent paint to it, well, you can make it look like Nurgle pus lying on the ground, just waiting to be eaten. And to use it, it's just this simple. You add the water to whatever you want to do, in the shape that you want to have it, if it's a drool or if it's a water puddle. Then add UV torch to harden it, and voila, you have a finished water base. 2-component clear cast resin is just fantastic if you want to create bigger bodies of water or ice effects. Our personal favorite brand for 2-component resin is Resin of Sweden, and you are going to thank us later. We also have gel medium, which comes from a ton of different brands. The most common one that you can find is probably from Vallejo, which is just called water texture. This one is great to use if you want to create drool, if you want to add like a glossy effect to like a beach edge, or if you want to have the wavy ripples on top of the 2-component river that you've done. And if you want to do small waves on your Warhammer bases, then adding a bit of cotton fiber, dabbing a little bit of this on top of it, bada bing, bada boom, you're gonna have amazing looking wave effects on your bases. There's other brands that make even more variations of this. You have Woodland SCENICS, you have AK Interactive, green stuff, make some stuff, and we haven't used a terrible one except for one that we got from Amazon. Other than that, they've all been quite decent. It's just different type of water effects for different purposes. Balsa wood. There is no easier way to sculpt wood parts and create wood texture than using balsa wood. For one, it's super easy to cut apart with just a regular EXACTO or a hobby knife. It's also super easy to carve into, and it's a very light material, meaning that you don't add a ton of extra weight to your basing. The negative thing with balsa though is it costs money, and there are free alternatives, but I'm gonna cover that more later in this video. After I talk about mesh nets. Okay, if you want to do like modern basing, maybe World War stuff, or even sci-fi stuff, having these mesh metal nets is perfect. You can either add it on top of the ground texture, or you can use it to make fences. These are obviously just two examples, but it is usable for a ton of stuff, and if you just Google mesh nets Warhammer basing, you're gonna be able to find so many cool stuff that you can do with it. And the best thing is it doesn't cost a ton, and you don't need a lot to make your bases look epic as frick. But now guys, it is time for chapter number 3. One man's trash, another man's treasure. Okay, as you've noticed, basing can be its own hobby and you can spend a ton of money on it, but here's a few things that I use for pretty much every army in some way or form that is completely free. First and foremost, guys, don't buy sand. Pot of Citadel or Army Painter sand costs, I don't know, what is it, $7, $8. If you live somewhere near a playing ground where they have sand, or if you live near a beach, just go and pick a small pot of sand from there. Bake it in the oven for 10-15 minutes and you're good. You've got sand. If you cannot get that, just go to your pet store and buy like 1 kilo bags of sand, and they're gonna cost the same amount of money, but instead of having this small tub of sand, you're gonna have 3 kilos now of mixed sizes of sand. And another thing that kind of goes into the same category is just get some dirt out in the yard. If you have your own yard, pick it from your own yard. If you don't, go into the woods, get yourself some dirt, but bake it. You don't want any cat pee or dog poo in there, so your minis are gonna smell. One of my favorite basing materials is roots, tree parts and branches, because dried up old roots pretty much looks identical to miniature-sized trees. And every time I dig up a tree or a bush or anything from my yard, I just collect all the tiny roots that I can find, and they have what looks like a tree stem and then branches getting out at the top, and it looks fantastic once it's dried. If you don't have your own garden, if you just go into the woods, there's always fallen trees that have the roots uplifted from the ground, and you can use those. Just make sure that they have some interesting shape to them, that they branch out, and when you use these, you can go creative. You don't have to just add, you know, one tree sticking right out from the ground. Now you can make it look like there's a root sticking out of the ground, and you can put miniature on top of that root, making it look really cool, like we did for my orcs from the last edition of Age of Sigmar. Coffee stirrers, chopsticks and toothpicks. Okay dudes, you know I talked about balsa wood and how easy it was to cut apart. Now let's talk about the free versions, because these can be found on pretty much any coffee shop, McDonald's or sushi place. And they can be so versatile you have no idea. You can use it as fencing. You can use it to make small bridges. You can use it as a facade for a wall. You can create a little dock. You can do pretty much anything you want with these tiny wood pieces. The use for these is, and say it with me, near endless. One thing to keep in mind though, whenever you use these things, is to cut the edges, make them a bit uneven, because all of these are very uniform, and especially if you're doing fantasy stuff, planks wouldn't be straight, you know, they would have dents, they'd be bent, they'd have some odd edges and stuff. So just make sure that they look a little bit funny and funky, and you should be good to use the free stuff just as well as you can with buying balsa wood. Plastic plants. Okay, this one you can either spend money on, or you just find either free or cheap stuff on flea markets. Because old plastic plants can be found for next to nothing. So try to find 3 or 4 differently shaped plastic plants and try to utilize these to your miniature basing. I have them on all of my goblin spider bases and they look terrific. The problem you might have is that the molds for these are quite bad, so there's a lot of flashing and mold lines that you might have to scrape off, and they look like shit as is. So you need to prime them and paint them up to make them fit with your army. Just awesome to fill out between your grass tufts. Birch seeds. Okay, birches, maybe you live in a place where you don't have birches, but if you do, you should go out during the fall and pick some birch seeds. They pretty much look identical to regular birch leaves, but in a tiny miniature scale. So you can either use them as is and just place 1 or 2 on the ground to make it look like there's leaves that's been falling on the ground, or you paint them up in whichever color you want. Maybe you want red or green leaves, like they're freshly fallen, and they're gonna look terrific on your base. Polar twist. Okay, so this is one of those things that a lot of Swedes have at home, or if you don't have it at home, you buy it at Biltema. This is the type of fabric that people used to polish their cars way back in the 80s and 90s. And if you put a little bit of this polar twist into PVA glue, water, and some pigments or paint, you're going to get yourself some awesome looking vines and lianas. I prefer to do them with like a green brownish color and just put them on top of whatever you have on your base, if it's old ruins or branches or trees, and it's gonna look terrific. I've done it for my spider army, and Lucas did it for his flesh eater quartz army, and it just adds a bit of ominousness that you cannot get without vines. Before we move on to what's probably the most important chapter of this whole video, let me talk about this week's sponsor, Into the AM. Have you ever wondered why Lucas and I look so freaking amazing in every video? Well, it's not because of our pretty faces, it's because we use Into the AM shirts. And Into the AM makes some of the best graphic t-shirts on the internet. And they are super nice for anyone that's a bit taller, like I am. My personal favorite of the stuff that they have on their website are these t-shirts with a small print in the front and the big one in the back. But in the past couple of months, Into the AM have expanded their inventory and make some really cool flannel shirts as well as graphic shirts. Just look at these beautiful ones that Lucas and I was wearing for a video a week ago. So just follow the link down below, pick yourself up some Into the AM shirts and get an additional 10% off your entire purchase. Because you deserve some nice looking shirts now that the summer is over and you want to look good for the winter. Now let's get back to basing. Composition. Okay, so this is a tough nut to crack, but I'm gonna try to focus it down and make it as digestible as possible. Because when it comes to miniature composition, you could write a book on it. It could be a 3-hour-long video to discuss different compositions on miniatures. You can make something like the Manta diorama that we did, or Ninjon's Golden Demon entry, which has a lovely composition. But a good composition doesn't always have to be something grand or super advanced. It can be something quite simple as well. You can create interesting compositions of your bases by just changing the pose of your miniature a little bit to make it fit with the base that you've created. A simple way of making an interesting base was the Stormhawk Interceptor base that Lucas did. It's how the Stormhawk interacts with the tree, like if it's going down on the base, and instead of having a flight stand, it is connected just a little bit to that tree and it just looks amazing. It can also be something simple like having your miniature almost look like it's jumping off the base. Or if you've created a base where the rocks that it's standing on is interacting interestingly with the miniature's original pose. Another interesting composition is where Lucas rearranged the pose of his dreadnought. He made it look like it's jumping off the rock on the base, and it just creates for a super interesting shape of the base. That dreadnought just looks completely different from any other dreadnought that I'd ever seen before. When I got started, because I didn't know a lot about sculpting, the easiest way for me to make the miniatures look interesting was to shape the miniature based on the pose of the minis. It could be simple things as trying different rocks and seeing how different poses worked on them, like my Kurnoth Hunters or my Tree Revenants, or heck, even Dryka, that has no conversion of the miniature but still has an interesting composition thanks to trying different rocks and trying different tree parts to make the posing look good. Another one that I did early on in my career was Gordrak, where I used his pose and put both fists on one pillar each, and it just looks really menacing and cool, and I got him a bit elevated on the base, making the composition a lot more interesting than if I would have just put him on the base as is. And I didn't have to do any converting. We also have obviously the opposite side of that spectrum, where I completely converted the posing of my other dragon in the orc army, making him look like he's flying around one of the pillars on his base. And this is another interesting composition where we almost created a tower-like shape of the base, and we have the miniature swooping around that shape. But that requires a lot more work. Another interesting way of creating an interesting composition is having miniatures climb down from things. I've done this myself with one of my big spiders, where he's climbing down from 2 different branches, and instead of putting the magician on top of him, I had the magician standing on the base of the miniature, creating a really interesting scene that tells a story about how this magician is guiding his spider to the next victim. And if you want to create the look of your miniature commanding his army from atop a hill, you can use this Fate Weaver as a good example for that, just having a slanted rock and putting 1 feet on the front of that rock and having him point across the battlefield. Just simple things that creates for an interesting composition, and thinking about how these elements can play with one another, the pose of the mini, the footwork of the mini, and how the miniature is holding its hand. And this is where you can stand out from everyone else, because everyone can buy the exact same things. They can buy the same cork coasters and just put a miniature on top of that. But you can create unique compositions with the materials that you've found. If you find things in nature, they are going to be unique just by its existence. And however you post that miniature that you have on that thing is going to make it even more unique. So just try to think outside the box, try to post the miniature, try to feel around the stuff that you have and see how you can make the most interesting composition with small measures. Chapter 5. XPS foam and styrofoam. This is not something that you need per se, but it's something that's good to have and good to learn how to use. And we have lately been getting into this big time because it's so easy to create interesting big landscapes on your bases, especially on the big characters, monsters, vehicles. And if you're building terrain, well, then it's even better, because building a mountainside or adding elevation to a large surface, XPS foam is your go-to material. And this is one of those kind of pay-to-win things as well, at least a little bit, because it's so much easier to work with if you have a hot wire foam cutter, especially like a PROXXON machine that just makes making bases like so much easier. But it's also a really big investment. We had run this channel for 4 years before we picked one up. But now that we spent that money for the investment, it was worth it. And the thing is, you can do pretty much exactly the same things using a regular knife or a smaller, cheaper hot wire foam cutter. It's just going to take you more time. To use it, you pretty much just shape it the way that you want it and then glue it on top of that base or the terrain piece that you're gonna make. So when we're making mountain sides, we make sure that we have an interesting mountainous shape on the base. If we just want to do it to add some elevation or like a shape to the base, well, we just use it for that. Interesting and fun thing with XPS foam as well is that it can be used for so much more. You can use it to make a brick wall. You can use a ballpoint pen to add texture to it to create pretty much whatever texture you want. You can build an archway, a rock wall, Eldar buildings. Well, the possibilities are endless. Now let's talk about bits. So this was one of the toughest things for me when I got started, because I really loved making bases, but I had no spare bits. And you shouldn't expect that you yourself have it when you get started. This is something that you build up from years of collecting. Maybe you buy a terrain kit here, maybe you have a miniature kit like Skaven here, where you get some small terrain pieces or maybe a bell from. And one after one you keep adding to that awesome looking bits box. Most of the terrain bits that I have is stuff that I purchased from friends or secondhand from gaming clubs or on Facebook. Because whenever people build terrain stuff, there's always some leftover bits, and I buy that from them and it adds to my collection. I use these terrain kits on my bases to create interesting compositions that really helps tell the story of that miniature or that army. It can help create interesting stories and create interesting compositions for our miniatures. Like this base that I did for my pirate Gargant. I am so happy that I had this one pirate ship left over from an army build some years ago. Or Lucas when he found this old tree from one of our Warcry sets that he could use use for his Stormhawk Interceptor. Or just simple things as the classical terrain walls. Add that, build up, maybe put it on the side like it's been broken down and fallen down. There's a million ways you can use different terrain bits on your bases. And if you come across one of these sets, maybe you don't have an idea for what you want to do right now with them, but pretty much everything I buy sometime in the future end up being used for either my army, Lucas' army, or a terrain build that we do. So you can never have enough, especially if you buy it on the cheap. Good examples of this is my Alariel base that has a couple of old Lord of the Rings terrain bits. My Iron Jaws dragons that have a bunch of different pillars and stuff from different Warhammer kits. And of course the wooden planks from my Lord of the Rings Goblin Town sets. The stuff that I've mentioned now is of course for massive bases, but if you're doing small stuff, or maybe a small champion or a hero, just save some stuff that might look like terrain pieces from your terrain kits. First thing that comes to mind is of course the Skaven bells. Just putting any character on top of those will look amazing. And don't be afraid of cutting into these pieces. Cut it in half, put it on the side to make it feel like it's sunken into the ground. Anything to make it feel like it's more realistic, like it's part of an environment and not just sitting on top of a base with basing sand on the side of it. Speaking of placing miniatures on cool bases, wire can be used for many different things. It could be things like pinning your miniatures onto that base so you can balance it on just the tip of the toe of that miniature, or making it look like it's flying on top of that terrain. But there's a ton of other use cases for different types of wire and steel wires and brass rods on your bases. One simple thing is just use it as an armature wire to create a tree on your base. Or maybe if you're using sci-fi bases, you can use different types of wire or guitar strings or floral wire to make it look as though there's a bunch of electronics that's been cut off and there's cables sticking out of the ground, or maybe a cable from a telephone pole. Well, the possibilities again are near endless. You can also use these tiny steel wires to create lightning effects by connecting them to a magical sword or a hammer and then just painting it up like it's emitting a little bit of light, and boom, you have a lightning freaking coming out of that base, pretty much like. PLASTICARD is one of the most useful things you can buy in a hobby store when it comes to miniature basing, especially if you do sci-fi stuff. You can use PLASTICARD to build pretty much whatever you want. Heck, you can even build an entire house like we did for our orc gaming table. We have a bunch of different beams, round poles, we have flat things that looks like metal bars, we have other flat things, we have thicker flat things, we have all of them. So if you want to build a sci-fi base, maybe you want to add cool textures and you want to make a spaceship flooring, it is so easy to just cut apart and make different textures, different patterns. Just try it out, go nuts, you're never gonna go back once you purchased a few. Sometimes though, less is more, making it look neat can be nice too, so go too nuts sometimes and not nuts sometimes. Chapter 6. Sculpting tools. When it comes to making awesome looking bases, the one thing that elevated me and Lucas the most, I'm putting words in his mouth, is that we started sculpting stuff on our bases. We mostly use APOXIE, it's a 2-component epoxy clay, and it is so easy to work with. And what you can do with it, well, if we've previously said that the possibilities are endless, with clay it is literally endless because you can sculpt whatever you want. Some of my favorite dioramas and golden demon bases have been sculpted from scratch with clay, but it doesn't have to be that advanced. You can start with simple things such as making that tree that you had go together with the base a little bit more, just sculpting those branches and roots so that they feel more part of the environment. Maybe it's just adding a tiny piece of rock on top of that cork bark to give that miniature a perfect pose. Simple things can make your bases go a long way, and using epoxy clay is going to lift your minis to the next level. Even just using it for base purposes. Of course, making bases like Lucas' entire army base or Maxime Panaud's awesome looking troll base is going to take a lot of practice. But it's better to just buy a box of epoxy and get started with the small things, and then once you get more comfortable, you can expand it to the next level. Just like with all the other stuff, every time I recommend a product, I'm gonna try to put the link in the video description, and we have it listed on our website, squidmar.com. If you check the gear category, there we have all the stuff that we recommend. And when it comes to sculpting tools, I pretty much just use my thumbs, Vaseline, and 1 or 2 silicone sculpting handles. You don't have to buy everything when you get started. Keep it simple. Pigments. When we've added sand or texture paste to our bases, no matter how well we paint the bases, it is going to look like texture paste or it's going to look like sand. And no matter how well you paint it, you're never going to make it look like it's a dusty, sandy field or a muddy, muddy ground somewhere. The main problem with this is just the scale of the texture. The scale of the sand texture is just too big. It is sand texture made for our scale, not 1/56th scale that Warhammer is. Which means that this sand pebble is 1/56th too big for your base. At least if we want it to look realistic. So to get the dirt and dusty feel that we want to have on our bases, we can use dry pigments. If you just add a drop of water and flow improver to your pigments and put them on your base, once it dries, it is going to look exactly like a dry, dusty dirt or sand. And it's gonna look like it has the perfect texture for the world that it's in. If you play with these a ton, adding a thin layer of ultramatte varnish through the airbrush is going to seal it a little bit better. But if you're just doing it for display base, if you're careful with your base, you don't need to varnish it. Chapter 8. Pitfalls. We've already mentioned one of the biggest pitfalls using cork coasters, that they end up looking just like cork coasters. But one of my biggest icks that I see people do when making bases is that they have this great idea of adding different size small rocks and sands to their base, which is natural in real life. You have small rocks and bigger rocks and medium rocks spread out on the ground. But when they add that bigger rock piece or a root on top of their sand, they just put it on top of the sand. And then it's just gonna look like you added a piece of pebble on top of your basing texture. Instead, what you want to do is to add the bigger stuff first and then add your sand or ground texture on top of it. One other big pitfall that kind of goes into the same theme of not bringing things is to not bring things together properly. And this one might feel a little bit contradictory because often when you make bases, you can take a lot of shortcuts. Maybe you don't have to fill every gap on that miniature that you've added to the base, or make sure that every part is glued together and you have roots of everything coming out exactly naturally. But if you don't do that, then you have to cover up the faults and add things on top of it to cover these mistakes. And if you don't cover up these things, everything will be in vain. It's gonna look fake. So you can hide these seams that aren't perfectly seamlessly going together by maybe adding a bit of super glue and sand to covering that edge. As an example, maybe you're building 2 broken wall pieces together and you have a little bit of a seam that isn't perfectly going together. Just adding a piece of super glue and sand, and then when you paint it like it's rust. It's going to bring all of that together without you having to gap fill and perfectly sculpt that area. Another shortcut that you can take is to maybe just add a little bit of grass tufts covering some of those areas. To cover up that feeling that you've just added that terrain piece on top of that sand. If you add grass tufts along that edge, it's gonna feel like it's always been there. And this is another one of those steps where bringing out the epoxy clay is just perfect, because maybe you have 2 different tree parts, branches or roots that you've put together on the base. Adding a little bit of epoxy and sculpting those 2 together is going to make it feel like those 2 have always been together, like you found that perfect tree stump that just fits perfectly on the base. But with this, you can make it yourself. We can take these 2 pieces by Chris Sir as an example. If you look at the stairs that he's made, he added a little bit of sculpting clay between each one of these, and bada bing, bada boom! It looks like they've always been together once painted. And here we have another piece by him where he's put 2 different branches together to give them the perfect shape that he wants. And once he adds that sculpting clay between these 2 branches, it's gonna be perfect. 3D printed bases or pre-made bases. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a massive growth in the pre-made bases and 3D printable basing material industry. If you're not massively into the hobby, but just want awesome looking bases quickly, companies like Gamers Grass makes pre-made bases, and they honestly look really good. They do, however, cost quite a bit. And when it comes to 3D printable bases, Epic Basing do have some pretty epic basing bits that you can 3D print. It does add not only the cost of the STL file to 3D print, but you also need to have a 3D printer, which, in my opinion, when you get started with basing, might not be the way to go. But if you already have a 3D printer, it is so worth checking out what they have, because they have everything from desert stuff like cactuses and desert rocks. And if anything is a shortcut to great looking bases, getting 3D printable basing bits, well, it's gonna jumpstart your basing skills from 0 to hero in no time. But maybe it's not as creative. So if that's not what you want to do, let's continue with the stuff that you can do yourself. The absolute cheapest way of making your bases is by just using paints. And this might sound stupid, but Lucas and I, we've done lava bases, and whenever we do lava bases, sure, we might add some bits to create interest on the base, but these can be made completely for free by just using paints. If you use vibrant covering oranges, add these lava flow to it, and then just add a couple of black spots, your lava bases are gonna look amazing in no time, and it was completely free. We also have this dungeon style bases that we tend to do from time to time, where we do cobblestone bases by just using a green paint and some ivory. We've done this both on 40k minis, like with this Torgardon, but also on all of our Hero Quest sets. And despite not using a single basing material on these bases, they do look fantastic. And the last one is Lucas' sci-fi neon bases that he did for his Drukhari, and again, with 0 cost, you have an amazing looking base. Chapter 10. And now guys, it's time for our last chapter, and that is high-end basing techniques. And what do we mean about this? Well, that is basing techniques that requires probably the same amount of practice as painting does, or sometimes it's its own hobby. Because when you start out with basing, it is the simple stuff. You use maybe cork bark and sand and paint that. Many times that will be enough to make your armies look amazing. But we are here to take the extra steps. And to take those extra levels, you need to have a plan, and you need to sketch out your ideas before you start working on them. And that means both in concept and in composition. And combining this with all of the steps that we talked about in this video, but there are also other cool techniques that you can learn. One of the high-end techniques that we started using over the past couple of years is adding lights to your miniatures. It can be either simple things like having tea lights on your miniatures and adding them in fun ways, but it can also be soldering LED filaments on your bases, adding cotton fibers to make it look like there's flaming oil barrels on your miniature bases. And we did this with our orc gaming table, and it just adds so much atmosphere and tells so much more of a story on the gaming table. I also added some cool light effects to my Loon Shrine, and it just adds so much to the atmosphere of the army. But let's not forget about the ultimate high-end basing technique, and that is resin pours. And we've lightly covered this earlier with Resin of Sweden and their 2-component resins. And when you do small water effects, just use the Vallejo water texture or the UV resin. But if you want to do the big resin pours, or maybe a big icy lake or something like that, you need to master what you do before you start, and that is pretty much its own topic, because you might have to get an air conditioner to have the perfect temperature where you're doing the pours, or having a pressure pot to make sure that you have no gas bubbles in that resin pour. And it's just too much to cover in this video, but learning how to master it can take your bases from being a great base to like an insane level base. Just look at this ocean that we did next to the Manta diorama. This Space Marine trapped in ice that we did that was massively inspired by Mescaik, the Warlord Titan diorama, or Lucas Ogres. Just learning how to do this can make your armies look so much better. But practice before you do it, because very likely you're gonna fuck up an army or two if you don't. I hope you learned a bunch of stuff in this video. If you did, smash like so this video gets spread to new people. If you don't smash like, Lucas is not getting a cookie this week. Massive thanks to this week's sponsor, Into the AM. You guys make some awesome t-shirts, we have the link down below. And of course, our massive patrons. If you want to support this channel, go check out our Patreon page filled with behind the scenes stuff and an awesome Discord channel. With that said, have a great day. Bye bye.